Leonard Bernstein, who led the performance you're going to hear in this video, declared the Song of the Earth to be Gustav Mahler's greatest symphony, and he may well have been right. It certainly is an astonishing achievement, a full-fledged song symphony, the first of its kind, quite unlike anything that had been written before. In earlier years, Mahler had, of course, written the two orchestral song cycles that I've treated in this series, but Das Lied von der Erde is nothing like those. Arriving a couple of years after the Eighth Symphony, it's nothing like that either, although in a sense it does stand as a clear and ideal complement to the former, the first ever fully choral symphony. Despite its novelty, there are deep ties of kinship here to Mahler's earlier symphonies, and I'll mention a few that I find particularly fascinating as I take you through a general description of the piece. Das Lied von der Erde is organized in 6 movements. We've seen this before in Mahler's Third Symphony. This is nothing like the third, however. Each of the movements is for a vocal soloist and orchestra, and the orchestra varies greatly in size and usage from movement to movement. In fact, I've included the roster. You might want to pause the video at the beginning of each movement and just take a look at that, because what Mahler omits in movements is every bit as significant as what he adds. The movements are traded in steady alternation between a tenor soloist and an alto, with the tenor opening the set and the alto closing it. The final movement is clearly the main movement of the piece, and it's almost as long as the other 5 taken together. In that sense, Das Lied is very much like the other final movement symphonies by Mahler, notably the first, second, sixth, and eighth. The title of that final movement, as well as its lyric content, places this work among Mahler's farewell symphonies, with that long musical goodbye completed by the 9th and unfinished 10th. I've always been haunted by the fact that Mahler never heard a single performance of any of those pieces. There's an echo of Beethoven in this piece, namely the Lebewohl, that is, farewell motive from his 26th piano sonata, a 3-2-1 melodic descent that figures prominently in the present work's first and final movements. That motive is fragmented at the end, left incomplete, for several iterations of ewig, forever. I've long been struck by the fact that this halting, incomplete expression of leave-taking at the end of Das Lied is taken up immediately at the beginning of the 9th Symphony, albeit in a whole step higher. The song texts are selected from the stanzas of Hans Bethge's loose adaptation of verses from Tang Dynasty poets Li Taipo, Chang Si, Meng Qiaoyan, and Wang Wei. These texts plumb themes of earthly joy and sorrow, frivolity and gravitas, fellowship and solitude, love and loss, life and death. The movements in order are the drinking song of earthly sorrow, the solitary one in autumn, of youth, of beauty, the drunkard in spring, and the farewell. I'll treat the first 5 movements in this video, and the final movement I'll treat separately on account of its length and weight. The first 2 movements speak closely to each other in the manner of symphonic complements. The drinking song of earthly sorrow is a hard-driven, utterly humorless A minor orchestral and vocal diatribe that sets the tone of the whole work. Its title might be considered extensible to the entire composition, and indeed Mahler appears to have thought of doing exactly that. This grim, driven movement opens with a blast of horn fourths and mocking, maniacal woodwind laughter. First violins respond with an angry tune that begins in long, accented descending notes, A, G, E, that is, degrees 8, 7, 5 of the Aeolian scale on A. This 3-note motive is the glue that binds the whole 6-movement work together, although not nearly as obviously as, say, the recurring major-minor motto from the 6th Symphony, accompanied by the threatening pounding of timpani. For the opening movement, Mahler has organized Bethge's poetry into 4 stanzas, 3 of them ending with the haunting refrain, Dunkel ist das Leben, ist der Tod. The 3rd stanza is the one that's different, an island of calm in the midst of a raging storm, preceded by an equally serene orchestral prelude. This music and the poetry that is sung here will return in a glowing major key transformation during the final movement, Mahler's own personal postscript to the poetry of others. The moment of recapitulation in Movement 1, which leaves the firm impression of a movement in sonata form, thus securing the work's claim to symphonic status, is simply terrifying. The singer driven to the edge of expressionistic madness by a most awful vision. If you are unfamiliar with this work, I'd encourage you to prepare to dive deep and experience its full measure of horror. If you can do that, this may well be the most profound musical experience you've ever had. The first movement ends with a high woodwind scream and a brutal orchestral guillotine stroke. As the air gradually clears, the symphony's slow movement begins quietly in D minor, a sad song for oboe and alto voice, borne along by strains that rise from a small orchestra, rising to a couple of peaks of ungrounded hope and falling again into gloom to finish there. The first 2 movements thus set the symphony in motion in a way that's not unfamiliar, except for the presence of the human voice as the main carrier of themes in both. The next 3 movements arguably belong together, painting the world and the human response thereto in a rich and kaleidoscopic way. An irony-laced paean to youth that underscores its shallowness and frivolity, a testimonial to beauty that also gives an account of irresponsible exuberance bordering on brutality, and a hymn to drunkenness. Those movements are set in B-flat major, G major, and A major, respectively. It's a curious feature of both movements 3 and 4 that they end on second inversion tonic chords, thus tying them more closely to the movements that follow, and drawing the 3 movements together into a symphonic unit, a kind of compound, multifaceted retreat from the present moment that divides the symphony in much the same manner as Symphony No. 7, with its large outer sections flanking a central intermezzo that also exhibits a palindrome within a palindrome overall structure. Significantly, if Mahler had chosen to end this symphony here, it would, in many respects, have been a completely convincing and satisfying musical achievement, albeit a little brief compared to Mahler's other symphonies. Had that been the case, this symphony would have begun in A minor like the 6th, but ending in the parallel major, and thus furnishing a brighter complement to the 6th. And Mahler would have made a satisfactorily closed musical and philosophical argument, with A minor earthly sorrows drowned in alcohol, gloom turned to flush-cheeked good cheer. But Mahler did not end here. Instead, there's a 6th movement, whose relationship to the whole bears a strong correspondence to that of the Resurrection Symphony. I'll take that up in the second part of this 2-video set. I need to say a few things about the recording I'm using. It is not the one I wanted to use. I was all set up to go with what is probably the most beautiful performance of anything that I've ever heard, delivered by Simon Bischkoff and the Cologne Symphony Orchestra, a video of which can be found here on YouTube. In fact, just to demonstrate that there are no hard feelings on my part, I will link you to that performance in case you'd like to experience it. That said, I have to admit to occasional feelings of aggravation, certainly, with a touch of resentment, since I worked with great eagerness on this project for almost 2 weeks before learning that the copyright holder had belatedly decided to deny me the use of it. The recording I defaulted to is by the Israel Philharmonic with mezzo-soprano Christa Ludwig and tenor René Collot. This performance took place in Tel Aviv in 1972 under the baton of Leonard Bernstein. I will provide a link to the video of that performance in the description below.
Oh Alles auf dem Kopfe stehen, in dem Pavillon aus grünem oder aus weißem Porzellan. Wie ein Heimboot geht die Brücke, umgekehrt der Boden, Freunde schön gekleidet, trinken plaudern. dein